What's up, Houston Sports Nation? I am joined by Mirin Fader. Miss Fader, if you will please allow me quickly to share your rather impressive resume with my listeners. Mirin Fader is a senior staff writer for The Ringer. Her first book, Giannis, The Improbable Rise of an NBA Champion, was a New York Times bestseller, Los Angeles Times bestseller, Wall Street Journal bestseller, USA Today bestseller, Publishers Weekly bestseller. She wrote for the Bleacher Report from 2017 to 2020, the Orange County Register from 2013 to 2017. Her work has been featured in the Best American Sports Writing Series and honored by the Pro Basketball Writers Association, the Associated Press Sports Editors, the U.S. Basketball Writers Association, the Football Writers Association of America, and the Los Angeles Press Club. Miss Fader, you couldn't get a Pulitzer in there somewhere? You're slacking. What's going on?
Listen, it's all downhill from here. Okay, it's all downhill.
I tell you what, I am your newest fan, and the reason Miss Fader is here is because she is the author of what is sure to be her next bestseller. It's Dream, The Life and Legacy of Hakeem Olajuwon. I have my copy right here. Mirin, this is the coolest thing that's ever happened to me. You got to understand, I grew up poor. I never had anything before everybody else. So the fact that I was able to get your book before everybody else and got to read it, it's the honor of my lifetime, and I appreciate you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I'm so excited to talk with you.
Absolutely. So I want to ask you, after writing Giannis, which was your New York Times bestseller and every other newspaper in America bestseller, what was it about Hakeem Olajuwon that let you know that that was the next project you wanted to tackle and that was the next book you wanted to write?
Yeah, I feel like with the Giannis book, so much of that book, besides his life story, it really tapped into the current world that we have of international superstars taking over, specifically African superstars. And I just thought to myself, who created that world? Who was the first? Who was the pioneer? Who was the first African superstar that doesn't really receive credit, although his footprints are all over the current NBA? And I was like, oh my God, it's Dream. Like, why has there been nothing on Dream? It's so weird. He's criminally underrated.
For sure.
So I was thinking also, aside from athletically and the interesting changes demographically in basketball, I just love human stories. And, I knew the broad strokes of Dream's story. I knew about, Islam but nobody really had ever uncovered like, what was it that he went through that allowed him or to need to come back to his religious roots that so fundamentally changed him as a person. And it just seemed like the perfect human interest story.
Yeah, for sure. That's actually what I wanted to ask you. Like, before really diving into this, what did you know about him, and what part about his story surprised you the most?
Yeah, I mean, everyone knows the Shake, so I knew the Shake.
Right.
And it was really fun, I gotta say, to just look at YouTube clips for this and be like, I'm working, I promise.
For sure.
But yeah, I knew the broad strokes. Like, number one, the fairy tale of like, he somehow got on a plane to America, and then it was cold in New York, and then somehow he came to Houston and then became a superstar. I knew that. I knew like his reputation as this just like regal, patient, humble, quiet person. Like from afar seeing, it's so lovely, and such a breath of fresh air.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't really even know the extent of like, okay, he had a temper early on in his career. Like I didn't know, those things. I didn't know anything about his upbringing in Nigeria because nothing really exists on that.
Right.
I didn't know anything about like why he felt the need to return to Islam. People wrongly said, oh, he converted. He didn't convert. He just returned. So there's just been these fundamental differences. And one of the most surprising things, to your last question, that I learned was about the myth of the origin story of that. Oh, it was so cold in New York, I had to come to Houston, because that's the one thing people know.
That was the most disappointing thing. That's like my favorite story. It was so disappointing to find out that wasn't true.
I know. Spoiler alert. But it was so interesting because to me, that is also why he's so beloved, because it's such a dream,
Right.
right? It's fantasy, and people like ate that up, which is awesome. But I think it was honestly really cool to figure it out, because as a journalist, if somebody tells me like he grew up in Legos and then all of a sudden met this coach who took him to America, you're like, okay, how did point A go to
Hmm.
B, C to D? So
Yeah.
that was interesting for me.
Nobody expected somebody to come along and start asking questions, right?
Exactly.
And
Or
reveal the
want
truth.
Yeah, or think that, hey, something feels a little weird here.
Right.
Like, who is this guy that brought him? But that's why I think it was nice to bring, the 2024 eyes into, the 80s, the 90s.
Yeah, and I think you did a wonderful job of that. Now, I had always heard growing up, I was born in 1984, so I was born the year he was drafted. So I didn't really know about ill-tempered Hakeem Olajuwon either.
Right.
And it was very interesting to hear some of those stories and go into detail of just how angry of a person he was at times. Now, before that, though, I had always heard, hey, he was a soccer player, and that's where a lot of his agility and footwork came from. I did not know about the whole handball story. I had to look this up. Can you tell the listeners what the heck is handball?
I know. I was like having flashbacks to elementary school, and I was like, this can't be what he did, because what I did was not
The
athletic.
wall ball thing, right? Right.
Yes, exactly. But I looked it up and I was like, okay, handball is kind of difficult. Like,
Yeah.
you've got to have hand-eye coordination. It's physical. You got to duck. You got to pivot. And coincidentally, when he was growing up in Lagos, the sport was just being introduced to like the area that he grew up in. And so it was kind of like how kids now, everyone in your neighborhood plays little league, or
Hmm.
rec basketball. Like, everyone was playing handball. And so he was so good at it because he was so tall that like you could see over people, and it was almost like one of those bigger point guards that just have that advantage of the court vision. He had that in handball, and you only have a couple seconds to move the ball, so he had to be really concise and really precise with his movements. And so there was a quickness that started with him that, of course we saw that in basketball, but the quickness and those like early little jabs and pivots and things really started in handball. But
Yeah.
it was really cool because I got to talk with, his teammates from Lagos, both handball and basketball, because some of the basketball players played handball, and his coaches, who I hadn't seen anybody interview players and coaches from Lagos. So this was a real exciting opportunity to kind of bring that information first. And they were talking about how he was so torn between both sports that he had to like, and tournaments were at the same time, he would have to be like moved, like picture like whatever a golf cart looked like back then.
Right, right,
He had
right.
to be like transported from the handball court to the basketball
Right.
court. And they were like, is this man gonna show up for his game? And then all of a sudden he'd like show up like 5 minutes late. I think that's hysterical.
Yeah, that's insane. You think about Deion Sanders going back and forth between baseball game to football game, but they're literally probably within yards of one another, and he's going back and
Right,
forth on this cart.
right,
And to think of a man that big, I mean, I know he was probably 6'8" at the time, but still,
right.
yeah, it's such an interesting aspect to it, and the fact that Olajuwon was able to show the commitment to handball, to soccer, and then I want to talk about his transition into basketball. I want to make sure I'm pronouncing this name correctly. It's it was Yami Sengoye.
Yeah, Yomi.
Yomi.
He went by Yomi. Yeah,
He went by
and
Yomi. Okay.
Yomi Basket.
So how was Yomi Basket? How
Yeah.
essential was he in Hakeem's transition into basketball?
So this was one of the most interesting things that I, really uncovered, because in doing the book, wanting to like almost celebrate Hakeem's legacy and give him credit for being the first African superstar, I discovered how many others before him blazed the trail for him.
Right.
And Yomi's legacy, was unknown to me, and I really wanted him to be in these pages. He was a star in Lagos. He was a big man, but he could shoot. He was just a much, much more polished version of Hakeem,
Hmm.
way advanced. Hakeem idolized him,
Yeah.
and Yomi was like that cool older brother that like came back from cool overseas trips, and he was like, I went to this place to play and I went to that place. And so, young Hakeem is just like enamored by him.
Right.
And one of the coolest things I discovered was that apparently, according to, Hakeem's coaches and teammates from that era, Yomi was the one who did the shake.
Hmm.
And while, Hakeem's, dream shake was influenced by a variety of factors, like the ones you just talked about, handball, football, Yomi was shaking.
Yeah.
And apparently, Hakeem saw that, and that was the roots of it, which is something people don't know. So, um, Yomi unfortunately passed in COVID. He's in the FIBA Hall of Fame, I believe, and I was able to speak with his wife, his survived wife,
Okay.
and she was great because she was like, he and Hakeem were like brothers.
Yeah. I thought it was really awesome that you shed light on that and were able to give him his flowers. So many unsung heroes that go unnoticed in a lot of these stories. And I thought it was really awesome that you were able to shed light on that. So even though our favorite story isn't true, somehow Hakeem Olajuwon does end up in Houston. And I guess it's a little bit convoluted about how that happened. But he ends up in Houston. Guy Lewis is the head coach of the Houston Cougars. A lot of people don't understand how crucial Guy was in the integration of basketball in Texas and the United States. He was someone that a lot of people felt didn't get his just due for that, and as a coach. Tell me how he ended up being a really important figure in Hakeem's journey.
Oh my gosh, yes. Guy Lewis was such a tactician, and he was never given credit for the skill work and the fundamentals and the defense that he taught because, the criticism was he'd, quote, roll the balls out.
Right.
But he really played a fundamental role in, helping Hakeem even think about an offensive repertoire. Because I think what people don't realize, he was a defensive player pretty much only.
Mm-hmm.
Like he could dunk, but offense wasn't even something that he really developed as far as like moves and skill works and drop steps until the pros. So Guy Lewis every single day of practice was like yelling at him like, "Don't put the ball on the floor." That
Right.
was my best Guy Lewis. And he was so colorful and so full of life, and he would rip you apart when you didn't play hard.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I thought it was so important to talk about the history. There's so much history at the University of Houston. Talk about things I didn't know. I had no idea they were they were pretty much the first school to integrate their sports teams
Mm-hmm.
in the South. I had no idea that Houston was one of the most segregated cities at the time of Jim Crow. The history, what Guy Lewis did to try to have a diverse team, but also not lean into these awful white savior tropes either. Make no mistake, the
Right.
book says he wanted to win. It wasn't like
Of
of some
course.
moral, clarity. So I just thought that was interesting because you take a person from Africa who then comes to the US in the late, 70s, and they don't just go anywhere, they go to the South.
Right.
We cannot divorce the racial politics of that era from the environment that Hakeem was in. The Houston Cougars primarily had a black team by that time, and there was a poster that Robert Jacobus, a wonderful historian whose books on this topic are a must read. I recommend him to all of you. He sent me this poster that a fan, I believe it was at Arkansas, put at a Cougars game during Hakeem's tenure, and it said "Cage the Cougars." So that's the type of era that Hakeem was playing in.
Yeah. We sometimes like to imagine that that was so long ago.
Right.
But we're talking about just a few years before. I know I was born in '84, so it's not all that far removed. And I'm glad you brought that up because that was actually my next question. Coming from another country to the States is already difficult. Coming from Nigeria to the deep South in the late '70s, early '80s, that's a whole nother set of challenges. And you talked about a lot of those challenges he faced in the book. There's unfortunately not a large enough population of Americans who don't think Africa is a country. And talk about in the '80s how that was even more so. I mean, he had a lot of, I don't even know if it's masked racism that he faced.
Yeah.
It was just ignorance.
Yeah. Yeah, a great point. You know what? I think this goes back to like how we started this conversation is like so much was unknown about his story. And the only thing I really ever heard about the college years was the myth story that we're talking about. And then also like the glory of Phi Slamma Jamma. But you never hear about racism. You never hear about the Southern politics. You never hear about, the lasting effects of Jim Crow. And honestly, thank God newspapers are preserved, because looking back at them and the things that were written about him
Yeah,
were
that was wild.
it was wild. Like, one comes to mind, they were like, he swats flies like he does his native he swats shots like he does flies in his native, Nigeria. I
Right.
mean, they thought of Nigeria as this war-torn, poverty-stricken place when, he grew up middle class, which I really wanted to explore, and, the benefits of travel. His family was very well educated. They traveled. Fashion was a thing for them. So, just he couldn't understand how people thought so wrongly of Africa, and how their misconceptions were just so ridiculous. And I honestly think, that there's no proving it, but I kind of made the point in there in one part about, I wonder if his kind of reluctance to, open up with media once he got to the Rockets had to do with the kind of questions he would be asked from media in college, like, does
It's hard
anybody
to
in
yeah.
Legos know what you're doing? Yeah. So
It's hard to
I
imagine not, right?
exactly. Yeah. So I just thought that was super important to share. And the misconceptions honestly would continue on in the pros, which is something that also wasn't talked about.
Yeah. And I don't know if this would be speculation or not, but do you believe maybe some of that contributed to his anger, to his discomfort at times and emptiness?
I who's to say, but I think it just it was in the background all of the time.
Hmm.
But I honestly, I think the anger is more, he's just a competitive human being.
Right.
And there's competitive, and then there's dream competitive. And I
Right.
I just because the more I learned about it, I was like, "Oh, he actually had that in college too." There's that one fight with the, UCSB player in
Hmm.
there,
Yeah.
which actually turned into one of my favorite anecdotes. I won't spoil that one, but he comes back like 300 pages later.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I think I don't know. I think it's hard to say, but I think it's just he was so competitive. But as he would put it later in life, he just didn't have the discipline, that religion would later give him.
Got you. Got you. Really quick, let's talk about Moses Malone, the
Oh yeah.
Fond Center, and how crucial he played of a role he played in Hakeem Olajuwon's development on the court.
Yeah, really crucial. I mean, I don't think people under 30 know that Moses Malone was an absolute beast. Like, the
No.
way that he got rebounds at his size, and like I learned that he would like judge he would look at the mechanics of the rim, like, just
Mhm.
incredible player. And so he takes Hakeem under his wing. And what I appreciated, it wasn't like he came over there and was like, here's lesson number one, here's lesson number two. He would just show him, like,
Right.
he would kill him on the court.
Yep.
And there's no better teacher than getting embarrassed.
Right.
And so the mentorship was just day after day of getting pounded in the post. And I just the only thing I really knew about Malone was his dominance, but what I learned through this book was his selfless giving spirit. He would give Hakeem hand-me-downs of his clothing.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, a lot of people still get emotional when they talk about his death, and they were like, he would give anything. So I just thought he was the consummate mentor.
Yeah. I thought you did a really good job in this book of handing out flowers to some of the unsung heroes. I mean, Moses Malone rarely gets mentioned among the greatest players of all time, unless you're getting further down the line. Hakeem
Right.
Olajuwon the same, Guy Lewis, Yami. I thought you did a great job of
Thank
shedding
you.
light on. There's more heroes in the journey of Hakeem Olajuwon than just himself. Um,
Thank you.
and I want to get to Phi Slamma Gemma really quick. If you didn't live through it,
Yeah.
which I didn't, because like I said, I was born in '84. But I've watched plenty of documentaries, and my father tells me stories. These guys were rock stars.
Oh my god. The satin, like, warm-up suits alone,
Right.
I just they would just give so many people today a run for their money. Like, I loved that part. And then talking with the beat writer that came up with the term, and how he was just kinda like, "Whenever I'm on deadline, I'm just gonna do it." And then
Right.
it ended up being a whole thing. Um, it's just fun. And like, when I would ask the players about it, they would just light up. It was
Yeah.
just, it's a thing. If you were there, you'd know it was a cultural moment. It's one of the most underrated moments. Um, it ends in heartbreak, but I
Right.
think, just the fact that sorry, Houston people, I know it's a sore subject. Every time I ask about it,
Yeah.
they're like, "Ma'am, I'm about to hang up on you."
Yeah, yeah.
I just think we don't talk about, like, fun in basketball enough and
Yeah,
joy, and you see this in a lot of our, like, NBA discourse about, like, it's just really cold and mean, and, Phi Sigma Gamma was just, like, a total alternate universe where you would just spend hours asking people, "What was your favorite Clyde dunk?" Or, like,
right.
"What was the best fast break?" Or, like, "What did it feel like to go at each other in practice every day?" Like, I just thought it was really fun.
Yeah, the moniker was, kind of this faux fraternity, but that team really did become a group of brothers even to this day.
Right. Right. Yeah, just to see that the friendships have endured, to this day is unreal, and also knowing the backstory of, like, when we talked about the racism and the
Mhm.
atmosphere, it just makes sense to me. There's the bond there is deeper. I also really think it's so important that we situate them within, Houston and the city and what that meant at the time, is
For
just
sure.
really cool. Yeah, I
Yeah,
love that era.
absolutely, absolutely. So Hakeem Olajuwon, he comes to the Rockets. He's the number one pick over Michael Jordan. Nobody blinks an eye,
Ever.
and he's immediately an impact player. Lost in the archives of the NBA are just how good he and Ralph Sampson were, even to the point of defeating the Showtime Lakers. Uh, but one thing that stood out to me that I think you did a great job of highlighting is even when he wasn't good, it was his work ethic that caused
Right.
him to be able to advance so quickly.
Yeah, exactly, because he wasn't it's not like he was so dominant, like you said, but, like and that '86 series was phenomenal. I mean, it was like his coming out party, and then
Hmm.
eventually with the Celtics as well. He was just a beast, but, um, he was not a finished product, and I think people don't realize that it took him work to develop the offensive arsenal. Like, he was not a natural. He was not a quote, "a dream," which
Hmm.
again, apologizing of him, like, it kills me every time, but I see why names stick. Um,
Right.
but, it kinda goes back to, like, what you were just saying earlier about unsung heroes, which I really didn't even think about until you said that, which so I really, really appreciate that. It reminds me of Carol Dawson, who just recently died a
Yeah.
few days ago, and, before he was GM, he was an assistant coach, and he was, like, the premier big man coach. He spent, like, every day with Hakeem in the post, teaching him moves and drop steps and things like that, and so, while the Shake is so many things, like we talked
Hmm.
about with Yomi and soccer and whatever, a lot of it is CD as well. And
Absolutely.
so I just, it's like it's a community thing. Like we live in such an individualistic time, but like there were so many people that made Hakeem great. And yes, it was his work ethic. Yes, it was his competitiveness. When you combine his personal drive, which is out of this world, with the help of community, that's when he really began to accelerate.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I'm glad you once again shed light on CD as well, because he was very crucial, and not just Hakeem Olajuwon's career, but I mean, the Rockets aren't the billion-dollar, entity that they are today without that era of
Right,
leadership. And he's the only person who's got a jersey in the rafters. There's no number; it just says CD, and that's how much he
right.
meant to this city and to this organization. So, Hakeem really became an all-around offensive and defensive dominant player. He was really the precursor to some of the big men we see in the league today. Anthony Davis, Joel Embiid, Nikola Jokic. A lot of people don't realize that. Just talk about how different of a player he was compared to the big men of that time.
Yeah, I mean, he is, like remains top 10 in steals, which is
Hmm.
insane for somebody of his size. So, like, that alone is just beyond different.
Right.
Um, but, he was, like, positionless basketball before that was, like, a term,
Hmm.
and, he could just take you off the dribble. He would duck this way and that way, and there was a creativity, there was a mobility, there was, just a fluidity that you just didn't see with big men, and they used to be big and bulky, and he'd stand there, give him the ball, put it in the hoop. He moved, he was
Yeah.
light. When you see him running the lane, oh my god, even just like non-highlight plays, just watch him run the lane on a
Yeah.
fast break. It is a work of art.
There's it's so hard to find a comp for him. When I try to explain him to younger people, I'm like, imagine if Giannis had the skills of Kevin Durant and Joel Embiid.
Right.
That's about the best I can come up with. I mean,
Right.
just to like we've stated many times, severely underrated. I think he belongs, me personally, in the top 5 of all time conversation. That's just me. I may be a little bit of a homer, and I know I try to have that journalistic integrity, but I believe he's the greatest center of all time, and that's just me. But I want to talk about how he became that. He's an NBA All-Star. His rookie season, he's one of the best players in the league. Unfortunately, he still had this anger, had this emptiness. I want you to talk about, because I think you do a beautiful job of highlighting how everything really changed for him when he returned to his faith.
Yeah, I mean, he was, he said it at the time. He was like, I'm materially successful. I'm wealthy. I am considered one of the best in the league, but I don't feel fulfilled emotionally, spiritually. And I think that's so profound to be able to just kind of look within and be like, I have all these things, but like, why do I feel so empty? And like he would call it, his dark years. And I think also, when I explored like why did he feel so empty? Why did he feel something was missing? It led me to the home of one of his mentors, another unsung hero, Henry E. Barando, who people like really don't know about at all.
Right.
He's a Catholic man that inspired him to go back to religion, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
And just spending time in Henry's house, Hakeem would go there like every single week and they'd read books together and they would talk about life and what do you want to be? What do you want your legacy to be? Who are you? Are you happy with yourself? And Henry said what was missing was his family, and it really put it into perspective. He left home at such a young age. He left everything he knew behind. He came to America. He did great. He succeeded, but it was hard.
Yeah.
It was not easy. And he was still a young man trying to figure things out. And he had troubles on and off the court. And so really, like when people falsely say he converted to Islam, like it's not true. He was raised in Islam. He
Mm-hmm.
just came back to that foundation. And there's an anecdote also that was so moving, like in the book, where he's just at the summit where they used to play and practice. And this man who he doesn't even know is just like cleaning the floor, sweeping the floor. And he comes up to him and he's like, Mr. Olajuwon, are you Muslim? And they start talking. He invites him to a Friday service. And Hakeem goes, and it's the most moving experience of his life. He's crying. He remembers being a kid, being at service, and it changes his whole life.
Yeah.
But it's not like he one day went to service on a Friday and Saturday became a saint,
Right.
right? So what this does is it really charts how slow and gradual the change happened. The ejections would decrease, of course,
Mm-hmm.
but it took a long time. And a lot of his Rockets teammates were saying how it wasn't this overnight thing that it's
Right.
portrayed as being.
Right.
It was a profound personal change, and that happens inside.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people can probably relate to that. And that's what I found so beautiful about the book is anytime we feel like we've lost our way, lost ourselves, anytime we can get centered back to our roots and like what our true beliefs and our true values are, it is a
Right.
beautiful moment. If you've experienced it, then you know. If you haven't, I say try to get there as soon as you
Right.
possibly can, because this world, and we talk about all the things he went through that were kind of underneath the shadows, the racism, all the tropes about his origin story and his history. And on top of that, you're a young man, you're not fully mature, developed, you have lots of money, everybody's got their hand out, they want your time, they want a picture. It's got to be pretty overwhelming. And so that's the Hakeem Olajuwon now that I remember growing up. I became a fan in 1992. The first game I ever watched was actually Rudy T's first game.
Wow.
Yeah, his first game as a coach was the first game I watched from beginning to end. I want to talk about Rudy Tomjanovich and the impact that he had on Hakeem Olajuwon, and in return, the impact that Olajuwon had on Rudy.
Okay, thank you for asking that because that was one of the most interesting things that I learned was the impact the other way around. But yeah,
Hmm.
so Rudy, he understood Hakeem. He was like the one who, throughout all the years of temper, he would have to walk when he was an assistant coach before becoming the head coach. He would have to walk Hakeem back to the locker room fuming when he gets ejected and calm him down, and be like, it's okay, let's just sit here. So when you do that a couple of times, there's just a bond there. There's
Right.
just a bond that didn't exist with anybody else. And, as Rockets fans know, Rudy wasn't really sure about taking the job at first, but he was the right man for the job because unlike the previous coach, Bill Fitch, with all respect to him, he was such a smart coach.
Right.
He Bill Fitch was like, it's my way or the highway.
Right.
And Rudy was more like, who do we have on our team and how can we, you know, um, make this team succeed around the talent rather than my vision. And so people mistakenly think, "Oh, Hakeem finally won because he trusted his teammates." It's not really true. It's more like they got a talent upgrade and Rudy knew how to work with them.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, and Rudy introduced the spacing and all that. He was very ahead of his time with modern basketball and the 4 out. So, Rudy allowed Hakeem to finally play his game in full because he surrounded him with talent and he allowed the offense to flow through him. He didn't make him, have to work double hard to get open because he knew how much energy Dream was expending on defense. So basketball wise, just incredible.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there
So
is a little something to the him trusting his teammates more, and maybe it was because
yeah,
he had better teammates to trust.
great,
But I think you do a good job of highlighting in the book that him returning to his faith, him becoming a more calm person, maybe a more cerebral person, a more deep thinker, that
right.
caused him to become a better teammate. And it's no surprise that all of a sudden the Houston Rockets took off in the process.
It's true, it's true. There's a whole section about passing out of the double team and how he just, like, hated that because, you'd pass it to somebody and then they'd miss, and it's like, "Well, why would I pass to him when I can make it over 2 people?"
Right.
And Don Chaney, who's a great interview, he was like, "Yeah, the man has a point." So he did, learn to become a better willing passer out of the double team and, in turn, a better teammate, like you said. I think Rudy was one of my favorite interviews of the whole thing because for him to he people don't Hakeem turning to religion inspired Rudy to become more religious, and it tried to make him, think of how he could become a better coach. This idea of bettering oneself,
Hmm.
like, the coach is the teacher, right? But when the student is changing themselves and acting so mature and looking within, it just caused Rudy to do the same thing with
Yeah.
himself, and that hasn't been talked about ever, so I just loved that.
Yeah. I'm gonna tell you something else I got the sense from reading your book. I can tell based on the way you described the change in Olajuwon as he returned to his faith. I sense that you have a deep respect, not just for Hakeem Olajuwon, but for the Islamic faith in general. Would I be correct in that?
Yeah, I had never read the Quran, like, I think, most people who aren't Muslim haven't, and it was a really beautiful experience, like, going to his mosque, like, because he owns a mosque downtown,
Hmm.
and, having, like, the people close to him be so kind to me and, like, explain things to me, and, I was when I was reading the Quran, I was looking for passages that have anything to do with humility because, he talks about how humility is so central to his faith. And there were so many passages that were really beautiful about like give in secret, don't give to have public acclaim, like
Right.
this idea of like give to give, don't and just how much of like I saw that was about giving and like charity. I just thought that was so beautiful and like
And
you know
selflessness. Yeah.
yeah, and so it's like okay, it all makes sense to me now.
Yeah.
It
And
just makes sense to me.
yeah, a big part of that too, I think Hakeem Olajuwon wins back-to-back championships. Of course, everyone wants to put an asterisk on them because Michael Jordan wasn't there, even though he was there for one of them.
Right.
And I will die on that hill. But I don't think that bothers Hakeem Olajuwon. He's comfortable with who he is, what he's accomplished. The accolades don't mean much. You mentioned in the book that he doesn't even wear his championship rings.
Right.
It's one of those things where he's very comfortable and happy with who he is. And I thought, you know, there's a lot of there's a lot of misconceptions about the Islamic faith because of a lot of the, once again, racist tropes and a lot of the fear mongering that goes on in our country about it. You mentioned that,
Right.
after 9/11, how it was very difficult for Muslim Americans in this country. Can you talk a little bit about how Hakeem carried that burden?
Yeah, this I mean, because the Toronto chapter, it's almost like, again, we talk about what we knew, what we didn't. He goes to Toronto and it's this weird, like, epilogue of a career. Like, it sucked. It's weird seeing him in purple.
Yeah,
There's all of that, but never talked about was how 9/11 happened, like, right before he got there.
yeah,
And, there's, huge Muslim populations all over Canada, and, Islamophobia was so rampant, and, if we remember in 9/11, the surveillance of Muslims, the discrimination, it was horrific, it was awful, and some banks would not loan, or not, I shouldn't say loan because that's not halal, but some banks would not, offer their services to Muslim people. And
right.
to learn that Hakeem helped save a mosque that could not get this bank to help them out. And he just did it in secret, didn't want anybody to know about it. And that's why, I really went through painstaking detail in the book to never reveal an amount that he gave, or,
Yeah,
because, in his perspective, that's between him and Allah, and how, you give in secret, right?
right.
But oh my God, he helped the local university students that couldn't find a room to pray in. There were so many anecdotes
Hmm.
of him showing up to mosques in Toronto and just helping and being a vocal leader. And he would say things like, let us show them what, Islam really is. The media misunderstands us and we are not what they think we are. And I just found his quotes from that time to be so moving and so
Yeah.
important.
I thought you did a fantastic job of highlighting all of that. You even mentioned in the book how his faith really wouldn't allow him to be directly involved with this book, but he did point you in the direction to the right people to help tell his story.
Right. Yeah, I thought that was really generous. And, um, when I met him in the home of Henry Ibarrando, the man we were talking about earlier, his home, he was so nice. And he was like, "What do you think of the mosque?" Because he coordinated with the director, and I was able to go and interview the director. And it was just really, really nice.
Yeah.
And, just him helping, like, a source would be like, "Hey, I just got a call," and he would be like, "Yeah, that's fine. I got a call from this girl. That's fine." Or
Right.
like, he gave me the number of John Ballas, his real estate partner.
Okay.
It was actually a really good interview as well. So I was so grateful for that. I think, he is a private person. There's a
Hmm.
reason why nothing has ever been done on him. So
Right.
I wanted to be really respectful and try to do this story justice.
Yeah. And I think, once again, I think you did a great job. I want to talk a little bit about his transition outside of basketball after the Toronto years, where he becomes a businessman and he becomes a mentor. Um, you mentioned a lot of the names that came to Hakeem Olajuwon to learn some of his moves, to learn his offensive repertoire, and to
Right.
surprise, not all of them were big men.
Right.
And that tells the story of just what a great player and how versatile he was. Could you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, oh my god. Steve Francis, like, patterning his game after Olajuwon, make s like, I
Right,
don't that doesn't
right.
make sense, but it does. But yes, like, it just came full circle with Giannis working out with Hakeem in 2023.
Mhm.
It was like, the book, everything came in full circle.
Yeah.
Um, Kenny Smith was a great interview for the book, and he said, "When all the best players come to you, that
Hmm.
is saying something. That is saying you are the best." And it's so true. Who did LeBron go to,
Hmm.
um, when he was struggling and needed to, change his game? The fact that they saw it's hard for younger generations to respect older generations, but the respect that they have for Hakeem is so profound. It's almost like
Yes.
speaking of, like, a saint, a legend, even though he is
Yeah.
not any of those. He's just an average, ordinary man. You can find him at the Houston AAU tournaments, sitting in the stands like everyone else, and they come to this barn. It's a literal barn,
Yeah.
converted barn into a basketball court to seek his services. It's really beautiful. The other thing is, a lot of older generations are a bit stingy with their goal. They don't want to share what made them good because they don't want people to
Right.
surpass them. The fact that he's so willing and generously open to share his secrets,
Hmm.
to me, I think is one of the most undercovered parts about it.
Yeah.
Like, that is a true mentor.
Yeah, for
Giving,
sure.
it goes back to giving, and sharing the secret sauce. But again, you could share the sauce, but like the recipe, I mean, only one person can shake the way he can. So
Right.
you can give them, but it's like when two people make, when I try to make something that my mom made and the recipe is the same, and why is it never as good?
Yeah.
That is the Hakeem experience.
Yeah, and another thing you did a great job of chronicling is the joy he got from seeing the
Right.
people he's mentoring
Right.
successfully pick up what he's teaching them, and how perfect point. There's a lot of players out there, they don't want anybody surpassing them or doing the same thing or maybe even do
Right.
it better, but that's just
Right.
not his personality at all.
I got one of the coolest parts was Jim Peterson, who I believe he's now the broadcaster for the Timberwolves. Not
Mhm.
not sure on that, but he was a former teammate, and they're still close. And he taped a private workout with Yao and Hakeem, and I got to watch the whole workout, and it was like
Nice.
so like it just filled me with such joy watching Hakeem light up when Yao did it right. Like Yao was really struggling with some of the moves, different bodies, different agility, different capabilities. But when he finally would do it, like Hakeem would get so like amped, and I think that joy for another person's success, it just really speaks to the character that he has, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thankful that you wrote this book because you brought about the mystique of Hakeem Olajuwon. I got to tell you, in Houston, he is like a mythical creature almost.
Right.
I have a cousin who, before she passed, and may she rest in peace, she actually got into a fender bender with him and his driver sometime in the late '90s, and she was just in awe. Like she would go around telling everybody, Hakeem Olajuwon's limo hit my car, and he was so nice, and he smelled so good, and it was just it was one of
Like,
these.
honestly, would I repair the car after that? Probably not.
Probably not. Exactly, exactly. But he's just such a giant figure, but yet such a humble and meek man. And you did a beautiful job of attributing that to his faith and shining a positive light on the Islamic faith. A lot of people in America don't even realize if you're Islamic or if you are a part of Islam, you're praying to the same God as everyone else. You're just calling him his name in a different language. And at the end of the day, what I've loved about Hakeem Olajuwon in that period of his life is he was accepting of everyone. You talked about how one of his good friends that brought him to religion was a Catholic.
Right.
To see a Catholic person and someone in Islam be able to bond over their faith. And I love how you talked about how they did have spirited conversations and
Right.
disagreements. And that's something that everybody in this political climate that we're living in and the climate that we're in, period, in this country, everybody could learn a little bit of something from that. The last thing I want to ask you about, and this wasn't originally a plan, but Dikembe Mutombo passed yesterday.
Oh god,
And
yeah.
the irony of that is I was actually reading the section of your book talking about Dikembe and how at first he was a little bit unhappy with Hakeem.
Right.
When that story came across on my feed, and then Darren asked me if I would write an article about it for the Dream Shake. Can you just talk about the relationship between Hakeem and Dikembe early, and then what it ended up becoming?
Yeah, oh my gosh, thank you for asking this. What a pioneer. Like, you talk
Yeah,
about pioneer, you talk about, a person who inspired generations of African players to feel like they could dream and come to the US, play in college, play in the NBA. Like, Dikembe did that.
for
He
sure.
is the definition of a humanitarian. I'll get into all that, but, um, the part of Hakeem's story that often gets lost is when he was on the Dream Team 2 in '96, the Atlanta Olympics. He had just gotten his citizenship, and it was a big controversy because in Nigeria, because he chose to play with the US instead of Nigeria.
Right,
And it's kind of, has echoes of Embiid and some of the conversations that we saw this past summer with the Olympics.
right.
Um, and, in Hakeem's perspective, he's like, I've lived in America for 10 years. I want to play with these guys. I want to represent this country. I'm proud to be a citizen now. But people back home were really upset, feeling like he, you know, was rejecting his home culture. And, Dikembe also being from Africa, he felt like, at first Hakeem should have played, for Nigeria and or a different African team,
Right.
if possible. And somehow the quote was he came up to him in a locker room after a game and it's like, we should all be playing on an African team together. And so he didn't like that. But Hakeem just saw it a different way. He's like, I love Nigeria and I love America, and the two coexist, and they are both parts of my identity. And the complex nature of that is something that only Hakeem is able to reconcile himself, and
Right.
Dikembe came to respect that. And I was so fortunate to be able to get a quick interview with Dikembe while he was going through cancer, but his wife assisted, which was really helpful. And
Wow.
thankful to the NBA international PR who helped with this. And he just talked about how much Hakeem inspired him, and he made it possible to think that it was possible to come from Africa and play in the US and make your dreams come true. And Dikembe had just profound respect for Olajuwon, and Olajuwon had profound respect for Dikembe. Dikembe was the ultimate ambassador for NBA Africa, as you know
Absolutely.
from reading the book.
Yeah.
So much, there's like almost a mini book within
Yeah.
about the history of hoops in Africa and how NBA Africa came to be, and how Olajuwon was central to that. But Dikembe was very central to that, and unfortunately, couldn't put all of that, but what
Yeah.
he did for NBA Africa, it would not be what it is today without Dikembe. He was the one that just gave countless hours, months, years
Yeah.
to making NBA Africa what it is. Not to mention his charity work in hospitals in relief. He was always thinking country first. He was always thinking, how can I help others? So
Yeah.
just a true, true good human being.
Yeah, for sure. Miss Fader, may I call you Mirin? Sometimes your next
Please, please.
sometimes your next book just writes itself, right? I mean, I was reading this and I was like, you could go to Kembe, you could do a Yao book. Maybe I'm a Houston homer, both of those guys being former Rockets. But overall, I just want to say, congratulations again on the book. As somebody who just began writing semi-professionally at the age of 40 and thought to himself, I'm pretty good at this. After reading your book, I realized, okay, there's levels to this. There's definitely levels to this. And like I said, you're probably my new favorite author. And I want to remind all of my listeners, the book is Dream, The Life and Legacy of Hakeem Olajuwon. It will be released on October 15th. You can pre-order now wherever you buy books. I will leave a link in the description to that you shared on your Twitter page so that people can go and pre-order their copy. Ms. Mirin, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it, for you taking the time out of your day to have this discussion. Please reach out to me if you are ever in Houston again. I would love if you would honor me by signing the book.
Okay, yes. First of all, I'm coming to Houston October 17th.
Okay.
I was going to announce it today. So it's at Brazos Bookstore. Please come to
Okay.
the event. I would love to see you and sign and all that. And thank you for, giving me such a fun interview, and for really like reading the book and caring. I appreciate that so
Absolutely.
much.
Absolutely.
Congratulations on everything that you're doing.
Thank
And
you. Thank you.
Houston's lucky to read you.
I appreciate that. I'm going to put that quote in the article. All right, guys, that's Mirin Fader, the up-and-coming New York Times bestseller for Dream. And with The Ringer, you guys can find her. I'm going to have the links to all of her socials, everywhere you can find her work. Thank you so much for joining me again, Mirin. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.